Today's edition of the Seattle Spotlight podcast, we have a very special guest who is both a Moorhead Kane alum and a senior product manager at Amazon. Rebecca, could you tell us about yourself? And thank you so much for joining us.
My name is Rebecca Sheppard. I'm a senior product manager for Air, Tech, and Science Planning. I've been with Amazon since 2016 and moved to Seattle from Atlanta, Georgia.
So as a fellow Tar Heel who has found themselves out here in the Pacific Northwest, could you tell us a little bit more about your journey from Chapel Hill to Seattle?
Yeah, so my journey definitely didn't look the way that I thought it would when I was still at UNC. I thought that I would be on my way to work for the World Bank or the IMF or the UN, and then I think for my scholarship summers, learning a lot about the Savior Complex and sort of how to do community work at home and in the community that you actually reside in all days of the year, not just during a summer or not just during a mission trip. And so I got a job in an industry that I thought was one of the most honest industries I could go into, which is transportation, because it's the movement of goods from point A to point B, and it seems like that's providing value to society, but also can give you an income. So I felt pretty confident in that decision that it wasn't as idealistic as I think I had originally intended, but it enabled me to connect with all sorts of things like my interest in human trafficking. So working on like flight attendant series where you train flight attendants on how to spot trafficking, and knowing that Atlanta, Georgia was the 13th largest city in the entire world for child sex trafficking. So I think realizing there's a lot of work to be done here, and to fund that work, normally you need a job. So it was a good hybrid. And then Amazon reached out to me in 2016. They said, hey, we're starting a company within Amazon that's going to be air focused, our own airline for cargo. And so I had been at Delta for about 3 years, and I was like, oh, that'll be interesting. Like, aviation is very much a legacy, sort of static industry. You don't see a lot of innovation in aviation. So Amazon, being a tech company, was very curious to see what they were going to do with the field. So joined, and since then have moved from the business side to the tech side. So looking at more like models and optimization, and how can you make sure you're flying your planes the most efficiently.
That is quite the journey. Could you get more into the nitty-gritty of your job at Amazon, and then more about the details of that move from Atlanta to Seattle?
Yeah, so my work at Amazon, right now I own network models and optimization. I own financial automation for payables and receivables. So it's been really interesting because Amazon moves so fast that sometimes there's not a tool for something, and so people are manually doing it in Excel, and you realize, wow, this really needs to have a process or a software designed around it. So working on what we sort of call technical debt, of when you move too quickly and then have to come back in and sort of fill in the holes of defining tech software and processes to make it scale even more than it already has. So that's been very interesting, because at Delta, all of that software already existed, and here we're creating it from the ground up. Moving from Atlanta was also a big culture shock. I think personally, I grew up in North Carolina, never self-identified as Southern. So even though I definitely am, I felt much actually more at home in Seattle than I think I ever did in Atlanta. The things to do here are hiking and going to like protests or going to different ways of engaging with your community and activism. And I volunteered through Amazon with Mary's Place, which is a shelter for homeless women and children. And it's, I think, probably the most shocking or negative thing I noticed about Seattle was how bad homelessness is, and definitely feeling a lot of guilt about the fact that Amazon has a role to play, as do Facebook and Google and all of the other tech companies in gentrification of this area. So interested to see how Amazon continues to handle that and delve through making Seattle better for all people.
Yeah, what role do you see Amazon playing in improving these situations within Seattle, given the company's big role in the city?
I know that Amazon has focused a lot on its partnership with Mary's Place and building more community shelters. I think you also, I'm sure, have heard of like the HQ2 announcement. I think Amazon is sort of divesting a lot from being really centralized in one area to sort of spread out and have different transportation hubs and different fields that exist throughout the United States. So I think recognizing that the scale and the growth of Amazon might be too much for just one city, and how to balance that and help support other cities that would love that growth and investment.
Circling back to my question about your move to Seattle, in our time here, we've noticed that there's some apparent tension between locals, longtime residents, and new tech transplants. Have you experienced that in your time in Seattle?
I think the funniest thing is the question you ask everyone in Seattle is like, where did you come from? There's never an assumption that someone is from Seattle, and so like and I think even people from Seattle themselves consider themselves unicorns. So I remember the first weekend I moved here, I was talking to someone at Target, and I was buying myself like an air mattress because my furniture hadn't arrived yet. And I was like, oh, where did you come here from? And she's like very indignant, like, I'm from Seattle. And we talked about how the price of rent was driven up and she's had to move, and how like her neighborhood now looks nothing like her neighborhood. It's all condos and high rises. And so I think like that conversation has happened in a number of different ways since then, of talking to other people who were raised in Seattle and acknowledging how much the community and the lifestyle has changed in just the past decade. So I haven't felt like it's a tension, but definitely I think there's an acknowledgement that the Seattle that transplants see now is not the Seattle that longtime residents knew.
Are you aware of any stereotypes surrounding the tech community in Seattle, especially given your role at Amazon? Have you experienced any of these stereotypes, and have you found them to be true?
I think that the pedestrians walking in front of cars while looking down at their phones is definitely accurate, and I highly recommend you spend some time in South Lake Union, and you'll see a lot of that. And if like I ever drove here, you sort of have to be aware that there's going to be someone on their phone, or possibly the really ambitious will bring out their entire laptop and be on their laptop while walking across the street. So I think there's probably a lack of being present with other people. Something that has bothered me a little bit in transitioning here, and I don't know if it's from being in the South to being in the Northwest, but people don't say thank you to people in customer service roles, and that's something that really struck me, that, you know, you get on a bus, you get off the bus, and everyone's just on their phone. They don't look at the bus driver. They don't say thank you for the ride. Someone hands them a coffee, they just walk away. And I think there's probably an accurate stereotype that tech workers are pretty self-consumed. And that, again, is a stereotype, so definitely I know some of the most humble and generous people in tech. But at large, it can be somewhat upsetting to see even like our janitorial staff will walk around and, someone will spill something and just leave it. And it's like someone else is going to come up and clean that up for you later. And I don't know, I think the idea of not elitism, but a rather elitist style of handling anyone who's not on the same level as you is a little concerning to me socially.
Seattle's known for having a rather intense tech scene. Do you see that tech community does it spill over into your social life?
I think so. I came from Atlanta, and I felt like I saw like a good smattering of people who are younger than me, people who are older than me, kids. And then I came to Seattle, and I mean, it's a great place to move when you're single because it's like everyone is your age. You can make friends. My next door neighbor became my best friend, and it's like we're both, in our mid-20s, and everyone is here. They're just moved from somewhere else. They're looking to make connections, whether that's like friendship or whether that's dating. And so it seems sort of like a mid-20s to late 30s bubble. And it's easy to forget that you'll ever age or that children exist because you get to bring your dog to work. So who needs a kid when you've got your dog? And I sort of think that's the way they like it.
Within that bubble you described, that young tech professional bubble, do you think that there's a strong sense of community and belonging?
I think that it is growing. Amazon is a huge company, and I think just like UNC is a huge school, if you don't find people you jive with, it's easy to feel lost in the shuffle. And I've seen a lot of people get lost in the shuffle and leave Amazon or leave Seattle, and I consider myself very fortunate that the first team I was placed on, I found a lot of like-minded people who were really supportive of me and really like lifelong friends. Like they would come to dinner parties and we would play board games. I don't think that's the case for most people. I think that in a lot of ways, transitioning even from sort of a more collegiate atmosphere to a professional atmosphere, there's a lot of like stay in your lane and small talk, but you don't ever really permeate past the small talk. And I think that's where real connections and meaning and valuable relationships come from.
With such a big company like Amazon, have you found that your social circle can become rather insular and you only interact with people inside the company, or is it easy to make friends with people outside of Amazon?
So definitely easier within Amazon. I think you see South Lake Union. Every building is an Amazon building, and so if I want to get lunch with someone who doesn't work at Amazon, that's a real hassle. Whereas getting lunch with someone at Amazon, we go downstairs in the elevator and meet for lunch, and it's a 1-minute commitment. So I think that there's the ability to be very convenience focused, and befriending people at Amazon is much more convenient than befriending people outside of Amazon. That being said, there were people I met during my Moorhead summer who actually one of them lives in Ballard in Seattle, and so she comes over to my house and I'll go over to her house, and she and I are very much in touch, and she's wouldn't touch Amazon with a 10-foot pole. So I think you can maintain friendships outside of it, but I think it's probably harder to establish those friendships.
In your personal opinion, do you see Seattle's tech community as being conducive or destructive in terms of building a communal sense of belonging?
I think that the tech industry, well, I won't speak at large because I can't pretend to know what Google or Facebook is doing. I think Amazon is very focused on diversity and it is focused on inclusion. Like if you go back downstairs and you look at the elevator, like they have all sorts of posters about Pride Month and about inclusion and about women leadership, and they'll do seminars. And I think it's sort of like Seattle at large. Like there's always something going on, but it's hard to know what's going on when you don't have someone you're directly related to or tied to, either a manager or coworker who knows about that and is willing to go with you. I think it probably is making it harder for people to establish a sense of permanence because it is so transitory. Like at Amazon, people normally stay in their role 2 years. And I sort of feel like that could be said of how long they stay in Seattle as well. And I think you don't take care of things or probably invest in things in the same way if you know that you're going to be leaving in 2 years as you do if you think that it's a lifelong commitment. So I think probably the sense of community has gotten worse, but I do think Amazon at least is trying.
Well, that's great. Transitioning away from your professional experience at Amazon and more your holistic sense of the city, how do you view newcomers to Seattle?
I think it's exciting, and I feel like it's exciting because newcomers come from everywhere. So, I've talked to people who just moved here from Hyderabad, just moved here from Tennessee, just moved here from the Ukraine. Like, I think it feels like there's a lot of different perspectives and experiences that come with new people. That being said, it is sometimes frustrating when you go hiking and you see someone littering, and it's like, oh, well, where they're from, there's no such thing as littering, so it doesn't feel like a big deal. But to me, that's like part of the investing in the permanence. Like, okay, if everyone litters, the trails are not going to be the level to which I enjoy them. So I think it is easy to develop some snobbery, even though I've only been here, I don't know, 3 years. So I think it's exciting, but I think at the same time you want to like preserve like my Seattle, which I'm sure people 5 years ago wanted to preserve their Seattle, and my fiance moved here like 10 years ago and he wants to preserve his Seattle. And I think Seattle is definitely growing and changing, and there's some fear of what it's going to look like because of all of that.
Now that you've spent some time in the city, can you identify any difference between newcomers and transplants?
So I'm trying to think. I don't think that you could tell the difference. I can't tell the difference. I don't look at someone and think, oh, they're from Seattle, or look at someone and think, oh, they're definitely a transplant. I think that there may be like a culture that transplants and locals sometimes have the same of, and that sometimes transplants are missing, which is a little bit more like against the grain, rebellious. Like when I first moved to Seattle, I lived in Fremont, and I really loved it. And people from Seattle told me it was like one of the few remaining pockets that felt like Seattle. This was 2016, I think. Since then, it's probably lost some of that. But it was, you would have very strange little shops. There was like I think like a comic book store, and just things that were a little bit eclectic and there's a statue of Lenin. Just because someone bought it, I think mortgaged their house to buy that statue of Lenin and put it in the middle of Fremont. And I think just like the randomness, I don't know if you can say that's the culture, but randomness.
So, what do you think of when I say the term Seattle freeze?
I think of the winters. I think that it's in the summer, everyone's in a great mood because you get sunlight. And it's easy to be in a great mood when you get sunlight. And something I didn't realize I would miss so much about North Carolina was the sunlight. So this last winter was especially hard for me. I think like seasonal depression is a real thing. And when you come into work and it's dark, and you leave work and it's dark because the sun doesn't rise until like 8:50 a.m. and it sets at 4 p.m., then you don't really get much vitamin D, and I think everyone feels that. And it's almost like there's like a collective attitude. Like when the sun's out, everyone's like talking to each other and waving and like chit-chatting and smiling, and everyone's in a great mood. And then on the dark days, it's everyone sits in their corner and they stare at their phone or they read their book, and we all sort of like go back into hibernation mode. And I'm definitely less social in the winters, and I think it's almost like a coping mechanism that people who have lived in Seattle a long time have probably developed even better than those of us who have recently moved there.
Okay, and finally, this may seem a bit redundant, but could you describe the Seattle freeze in your own words?
I think the Seattle freeze is sort of emotionally hibernating from the people physically around you.